A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to films I should have talked about years ago. So now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take ourselves a bit of a trip in the time machine and head back 20 whole years to the year 2002. What can we possibly think of when it comes to the year 2002? Well, for the most part, there was little to nothing involving the likes of social media, smartphones, and a good majority of streaming platforms. You could hardly do any of the stuff today compared to back then. But the thing is that one film in particular was indeed loosely based off of the life of the one and only legendary musician himself, Marshall Bruce Mathers Eminem III. 8 Mile from 2002 is basically centered upon the lifestyle of a man known by the name of Jimmy B. Rabbit. This person in particular wanted to have himself a career of being a rapper. In particular, the fact that Marshall himself plays this musician and basically depicts his own sort of life that ever takes place. 8 Mile itself does have a cast, not just including the likes of Mathers himself, but also the likes of Kim Basinger, whom was, back then, the former wife of Alec Baldwin. Of course, we know what happened in 2002 with her divorce with him, leading him to have a pretty depressing life. But above all that, what 8 Mile simply has in terms of a rather depressing, abusive, and undeniably bad life that Eminem himself had back in the day was certainly something you'd never get to find today. With all the people who want to argue about how bad life is today, think of what happened back then. Naive enough to believe that a million things could never have possibly happened. But that's just the sad, horrible, pathetic truth of all of this. So what this basically is it's about a 23-year-old who is now living on the streets of Detroit. After moving out from Missouri and Michigan, he now lives out in the good old streets of Detroit. A huge city with tons of different problems, just like with the majority of other major cities in the country at this moment. But what Detroit had for the most part were crime infestations. Of course, if you're familiar with all the Detroit-based stuff that had ever happened, it's quite important to know that these days are not like what we had back then. We know what people can do. We know what they're capable of. We don't need to assume nothing. We just need to have some simple common sense in ourselves and for other people too. But back in 2002, or better yet, this takes place in the year 1995 in Detroit, after Jimmy B. Rabbit himself basically moved out of Missouri. He previously worked for Little Caesars, because back then they were very, very big, and even today they are still huge, but of course, he now works as a car mechanic. A car mechanic who basically does not do a very good job showing up on time. But what he usually does in his free time is go to a location that basically hosts all sorts of competitions. The competition of who can do the best possible beats, who can spit out the most bars, and who can play out the best possible poetry that any musician could possibly pull off on their own terms. Of course, Jimmy B. Rabbit himself doesn't do very good against the likes of some other people, including a guy who is dubbed Future. He actually chokes at one point and leaves completely embarrassed, which, when you really think about it, is quite a big affair. After some time passes, he basically has himself a family who is not so worthy to him. An abusive mother, a sister, and her boyfriend. He doesn't necessarily have himself a good life out in a trailer home in Detroit itself. The place itself was not very good, but his own home sort of made it feel worse. But the thing is, this was basically all that he had to himself. He had a job as a mechanic, And that's what some people who were much, much lower working class had back in the day. You couldn't possibly get your hands on something that's as good as an electrician or an engineer. You probably had to work as a car mechanic at some point in your life. And I will admit, I've had some not so pleasant experiences as an automotive mechanic myself. But for the most part, as a man who is in charge managing mailing with FedEx, I will say things have definitely changed for the better, but things can only improve from here on out, hopefully. Anyways though, as some more time passes, there comes some other complications. B-Rabbit tries to have some extra shifts, but due to his habitual tardiness, he is denied. And then of course there comes a point where eventually a confrontation happens between his sister and her sister's boyfriend. They both break out in a bit of a fight, and Jimmy eventually punches him so hard after he pushes his mother away. Basically, the boyfriend, who is known as Greg, ends up leaving his sister's side. And this was all for an eviction notice that she did not want him to be worried about. So, all is pretty much said and done on that part. But then of course, the major moment in this film comes down. The rap contest itself, that Future himself is able to host. But after some grueling debate and after quite a bit of fighting that goes down, it eventually comes down to B-Rabbit himself going up against a professional himself. The way that Marshall Mathers was actually able to do music for the whole film by himself is certainly an achievement, to say the least. There's not too many people whom, in addition to making movies, can also be the composers for them. I will say, I've had some experiences on my own behalf in terms of making my own films, but not every possible piece could ever essentially become what you'd expect. But it does all build up to quite a big climax. B-Rabbit basically takes the trophy, and Future offers him to be the new co-host. But he declines, as he goes back to work and tries to find himself a good life to live, now that he's found success in his own career. So of course, that's just the end of it. It's quite a big drama with tons of violence and a lot of language, so you might have to have yourself a heart of steel for this one. But in any case, a good majority of people out there who might be fans of Marshall Mathers III will simply find this movie to be one of a kind. The fact that it's loosely based off of his own life in particular was one thing, but for it to have the likes of other such actors, music that was composed by himself, including the one and only Lose Yourself, which millions of people probably remember by this point. And I can't say that I wouldn't remember it, admittingly. So what would I have to give for this exact film in general? Well, just the fact that it has itself quite a unique storyline, and the fact that it is satirical enough to give us the actual life of Mathers himself, loosely adapted from his own life, simply allows for this to have itself a meager yet effective 7.1 out of 10.1. So nothing too exciting, but still, it could improve a little bit if you ask me. Even though it was successful in the box office and by a lot of critics, it still probably could have had a few adjustments put to it, so it could have been even better than it already is. So, goodbye for now, until next time.